I first met Bob when I was young, and you looking at me now, you can tell that that's a long time ago. It was at a session in the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy where he was speaking with Richard Schusterman, who I also met for the first time at that. My pocket is dinging. I hate when that happens. But anyway, Richard Schusterman has been here to give the Han lectures as well. So that was a rather, for me, momentous and fortuitous, if I knew how to silence this phone, I would do so. A rather momentous and fortuitous session because I was really, really engaged with what both Schusterman and Bob here were doing. And I have to say, I've been following Bob's work ever since. That was sometime in the mid-90s.
Was it in the early 90s or something?
Maybe the early 90s. God, it's 30 years ago or more at that point. But one of the things that immediately came up is that, so I had written my dissertation in part on Langer and was newly out of graduate school. And Bob was one of the only people I could talk to about that sort of thing. And so the Langer, outside of philosophy, Langer is doing pretty well, but inside philosophy, it's a pretty tough row to hoe. And so that said, Bob has just been dauntless and relentless in his pursuit of the things that were interesting to him and that sparked his imagination. And semiotics is the other one that we share, which was half of my dissertation as well, echo and curse and semiotics. And so here's a guy who studies Langer and semiotics and symbol theory and such. So I'm thinking, now, where were you when I needed you in my education? But in the years since, it has been an educative process to be in conversation with Bob, to read his publications and his work. And when it came time to combine the Han lectures with the Langer conference, there wasn't any question. Plus, there had been heavy, Lona, what would you? There had been heavy pressure to get him somehow.
Yeah.
It was like I know how we can get.
He's popular.
Yeah, and so
There's nothing worse than being got.
well, it's like Adrian was saying. These things keep coming to your doorstep, and nobody believes that, but we did. And so anyway, you guys, I know you're looking forward to this. So I'm going to shut up now and turn this over to Bob Innis, who will talk about whatever he wants to for the next hour. I assume that a more or less interactive session?
Whatever.
Oh, well, you do it however you want to, but if you guys want to ask him questions.
Sure.
Okay. All right, so make Bob feel welcome.
So I think I want to thank Randy for doing this. I'm still undecided whether I want to thank you, but I say thank you anyway, so that way I don't have to worry about it anymore. There's very different types of responses, of course, from Jared and from Adrian. I'd like to start, though, first with something that Jared was doing near the end, but also in the middle, I think, was the formulations. It dealt with what you're trying to do when you're teaching philosophy. And are you teaching them about philosophy, or are you teaching them what philosophy is about? Because you can control that second thing in a much more effective fashion. Because if you're teaching them what philosophy is about, why there are philosophical issues, you don't say, I'm going to show you why there are philosophical issues. You bring up the issues, and then they begin to realize that there are tools and instruments for dealing with this thing. There are ways of approaching it. And you can manage that pedagogical task by taking as your major goal, as what I've always done, is to induce perplexity. Teaching philosophy succeeds when you can make the students or lead the students to be perplexed about something that grabs them. And I'll give one illustration. I have several illustrations of this, but we were talking in the car coming over from the hotel about one of the last semesters that I was teaching a course called Ways of Knowing. And you say, oh, another epistemology course. No, it was called Ways of Knowing. And one of the books we were reading was Space and Place by Yi-Fu Tuan, who was a very famous and well-considered cultural geographer. And at the end of one of the assignments at the end of the semester dealt with Tuan's materials and how it bore upon anything they wanted to say. So, of course, then the semester is over, and I'm reading their final papers. And I'm sitting in the living room, so I wouldn't be totally distracted if I was reading them at my desk in my study. The temptation is to reorganize your study, or you reorganize your desk, saying, oh, I must have lost something here. Then you find your watch that had disappeared 2 years ago, that's under a pile of manila folders, etc. But I was reading this paper, and my wife was sitting on the other side, beyond the table that was separated our two chairs, and I started to cry. And she looked at me and said, "What is wrong? You know, are you sick or something?" I said, "No," but I said, it's this paper. Not because it was so bad that it reduced me to tears, saying, "I'm out of here, no more philosophy for me, that's the end." So I didn't know whose paper it was because all my students used only their student identification number, which meant that you tried to separate any form of bias from what you were reading. And Tuan has in his book a thing of embodied memories, how memories get embodied in objects or in particular spaces. This paper dealt with the death of her grandmother and of her grandmother's furniture, and also her neighborhood, because she lived in a town that had a split neighborhood, and that there was a dividing line, had a kind of affective charge, that she felt uncomfortable when she went over, even before her grandmother died, but when her grandmother died, it was almost unbearable, she said, and she didn't know what to do. And I said, I have to look up who this student is. I put the grade on and made the comment. And it was Katie Ballinger, who was a psychology major. And she had been a quiet student, and so when I went in to hand the papers back, I hand them back, but I walk around the classroom and, to give them a nod or something. So, but when I got to Katie, I just looked down at her and I handed her the paper, and I just gave her a very light pat on the shoulder and then went on. And of course she came up to me after class, not to say, "Hey, you touched my shoulder." It was sort of, thank you, right? Because she had given everything in order to write a final philosophy paper, even though she was a psychology major. I did not induce, the course in Tuan did not induce perplexity, it induced consolation for her. There you have a different version of Boethius, of the consolations of philosophy, because it allowed her to accommodate and to be present to her life in a different way. She wasn't worrying that she did not have meta-philosophical problems of, is what I'm doing philosophy? Well, what you're doing is philosophical, but we don't have to argue what philosophy itself is, or what it could lead to. Professionals might sit in the bar and argue about, well, you're not doing philosophy, you're doing blah blah blah. Well, it's better to go to another bar. Leave them, say, "Oh, excuse me," and they think you're going to the toilets, and just walk out the door and go down to the street to another one. And you have these things that remind you that I don't have to worry about philosophy itself. I want to worry about the things that philosophy engages, right? And it's not a naming and not a naming issue. And just by sort of coincidence, and the last 2 days I received messages from two of my two other students, one of whom I hadn't heard from in over 20 years. But she wrote me after 20 years saying that, thinking she had to identify herself, I was in your classes 20 years ago, and I took this and that, etc. But LinkedIn tells you what people are doing. She was an independent businesswoman. She had her own consulting firm. She had her own businesses. And she didn't go on in philosophy. She went on philosophically. She knew exactly what she wanted and was able to rest in herself. And you would say, hey, that was an incredible effect of somebody who was not afraid to take these risks. But of course, there's always a second instance of this. And I had another student whose sister was in one of my wife's classes. And there was a certain closeness with this student and also with her sister, because their mother was Danish and my wife is Danish. So they had this sort of link to me, knowing it was this and such and such. So I get from Facebook, I get a photo of her bookshelf and her cat. So if you first open that Facebook page, you see a nice cat lying on a bookshelf and with the books behind. But then you read her message saying, do you recognize the binding of the book right at the back of the cat? Well, of course I did. It's the Harvard paperback edition of Philosophy in a New Key. She was in the language, signs, and symbols course. But her job now is to be as I said, I think I mentioned before, is the sort of the director, the financial director of the public health system in New Hampshire. She has an MBA and the other things, and she goes on. But she was a wonderful philosophy student. She wasn't studying to be a philosopher, but it made a big difference. It gave her a chance to do real risks. She knew, if I can do this, I can do that. But I have a third example, and then I will talk more about these other things. Joe Faria was also one of my students, a guy named Joe Faria, and he was really good. But when time came for him to graduate, he asked me for letters of recommendation for entry into a college in Colorado that is dedicated to Buddhism. It's a Buddhist college where you can be certified in all these various things. He's in contact with me all the time. From Nepal. He's a monk in a business suit. He handles all the translations and things from this great monastery in Nepal. So, public health, a monk, right? A business person, etc. Philosophy leads to all these various things. And when we look out upon the faces of our students, we should realize that they're going to be facing in other directions that we are facing at this particular time. So the pedagogical issue is how do you make this real for them, to give them the self-confidence, the analytical self-confidence too, to accept that I don't have to imitate what I'm being taught, right? That you basically get freed from imitation. That leads me to a comment. I don't think that Langer ever really had to make a justification for what she was doing to anybody who really knew what she was doing. She said there was no reason for her to say, hey, what I'm doing is really important. Acknowledge me. She wasn't often acknowledged, that's for sure. And she had, in terms of the community of scholars or community of like-minded people, I think that she says, I'm going to do what I'm doing. Devil take the hindmost, right? And I think that's one of the great existential lessons that one could make, and and go there. So our job is not for us to induce wisdom in students. It's prepare students to pursue wisdom on their own, right? And the wisdom means knowing how to fit your life together, that you do the things that are truly fulfilling, that even if in certain respects they look as if they're sacrificial. But of course, students can learn that maybe philosophy leads you to be sacrificial. And those issues are philosophical without worrying about the role of Gestalt theory in your life. Although you could learn to recognize your life as a Gestalt, and that there is a way in which you self-integrate and become this distinctive form of a person, and who is living a life that is not just one damn thing after the other, but is a career, etc. So that is I think what I would most want to say to Jared's wonderful presentation, which was clear and precise, and that forces one to say, why am I doing what I'm doing, and why should anybody pay attention to it, right? And I think because we all realize these are vitally important topics, as Charles Sanders Peirce would say. That brings me to Adrian's trajectory, showing the so-called trajectory of my scholarly life. There is a way of explaining part of these things, and I said part of it is just accident. It's Tukism, it's Peircean Tukism of being at the right place at the right time, and following up of things that happened that happened. So many of you know, if you read the little abstract that I had written, that my copy of Langer's Philosophy in a New Key, my original copy, is that thin signet paperback, mass market paperback that I found in a bookstore in Rome in 1963. In September of 1963, I was out taking a walk, and I went past the Piazza di Spagna and was walking down the Via del Babuino, and was very close to Goethe's house, where Goethe lived during his Italian journey. I went into the bookstore. I said, Philosophy in a New Key. This sounds interesting. What is this? Well, of course, as you can see, one thing led to another, right? It was from there, things simply happened in terms of processes. So when time came to continue on in philosophy, there was already that particular philosophy book was lying there. But now I already had a degree in philosophy, but none of the courses that I took had anything to do with Langer. I had many courses in the history of philosophy. I studied with one of the world's great Hegel scholars, so I did Hegel scholars and medieval philosophy, and then some other topics in epistemology, you name it, right? But I never really had an aesthetics course, ever. I built my own aesthetics courses when it went on, but I knew what aesthetic courses would deal with, but I didn't really trust the people who were teaching the aesthetic courses to really, I think, answer to one's own needs under these circumstances. The abstract that I gave you on a trail of linkages involves rather different types of sets of linkages. First of all, my own linkage with Langer, which began there, right? But then, of course, you buy the other books, right? Because they were already there. So one book leads you to another, and then you pass through. So one is linked with Langer, but the thing about Langer is that she links you to so many other things. So if you really want to understand her, you say, "Oh, nice footnote, lady," and you go on. You can't get there from here, right? wow, this gal can write a footnote, right? No, it's that footnote is, say, this has to be followed up. And that Bueller footnote really, really intrigued me. But so it was lying in the back of my mind. But a few years later, after I had finished my doctorate, I got a message from my thesis advisor, who had a PhD in geophysics, and also a degree in philosophy and another degree in mathematics, and he did read the dissertation, but he didn't advise me on it. He said that's a good topic, so I wrote it and handed it in to him. That was my consultation. It was, you want to live dangerously? Just try. I don't recommend you try that, but it managed. But he was very interested in the philosophy of physics, of course. He wrote books on Heisenberg and others. But there was a meeting in Kronberg, right outside of Frankfurt, dealing with the Karl Popper's work and basic epistemological issues in the philosophy of science. And he said, "You're invited to this. All expenses paid. You'll live in this very famous hotel that I think it belonged to Queen Victoria's daughter, right outside of that's in Kronberg, the Schloss Hotel." And at that meeting was Elizabeth Stroker, who was the dean of the faculty at the University in Cologne. And she had already done a small edition of the Axiomatique. And she was very interested in getting that out in English. And I said, well, that's very interesting. I'll see whether there's somebody who could publish it and do it. And she basically said, well, why don't you publish it in English? Well, how could I say no? Easily, just say no, right? So I translated it, of course, because here was a better way of doing it. So and wrote I translated, but the translation doesn't take up a lot of space. I wrote a long sort of 60, 70 page not an introduction. I wrote a whole first part of the book that traces the nature of Bueller's Sprachtheorie and what's in it and what the foundations are of what he is, of what he's doing. But see, there's again accidental linkages, but something that one footnote and an unexpected invitation leads you to the pursuit then of something really, really important, and that makes a contribution to the common literature. So that is the second type of linkage. I've linked to Langer, or one is linked to Langer, and one is linked to her footnote, or whatever the book would be. I think everybody has parallel examples of this. And that links you to something else. But then Bueller really links you to other Bueller things. His Die Krise der Psychologie is a fascinating book on the philosophical foundations of psychology. That it's a kind of axiomatization of psychology, and it's still hasn't appeared in English. Somebody, not me. I've had it with this, but somebody should, if you know German well enough, would be a real scholarly thing to be able to handle that, and that would lead you perhaps to translate some of his papers on Gestalt theory that would be integrated with a lot of the other things. One other anecdote, then I have some other things I have to say, obviously. I not only said that, I forgot what it exactly was that I was going to say. But it deals with this complex notion of linkages where you're not forcing anything. And one of the lessons that I have learned is basically don't try to convince yourself that you find something interesting if you don't, because you will regret it, right? And I think in a certain sense that's what, if we're teaching philosophy, whether it's the intro to philosophy or my art and philosophy courses, etc., those are the crucial ways of not just spinning words, but actually pulling the students in. That leads me to the second thing, though, about the pedagogy. I always tell my students at the beginning of every course, I basically never used PowerPoint. I found PowerPoint too restrictive for me for other reasons, namely that the very first course I ever had to teach was when I was given a teaching fellowship at Fordham on the spur of a moment as a kind of personal favor from somebody else. The chairman of the department called me, and I had already said, hey, I need to get into this program. And he said, well, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. I said, but here's a letter. And he said, I'll get back to you about this. So the next morning, I get a phone call, and he asked me, can you teach ethics, et cetera, and can you do X, Y, and Z? And I said, of course I can. He said, well, if you can, get up here as quickly as possible. This was in New York, so I was deep in the heart of Flushing. It took about an hour and a half to get up to the Bronx, etc. And I walk in, and he says, here, sign this contract, sign this contract, sign this contract. So he said, so you're starting teaching today. Thank you very much. You pick up the bill, and I'm leaving, right? And I said, okay, sure. I said, I know what to do. And once I had 24 hours. It's not as if I hadn't studied ethics. I had not. I had a lot of ethics courses. So I said, so when today do I start? It was something like 9 minutes to 3 on a Friday. And he said, it's at 3 o'clock, he said.
You're late.
It's at 3 o'clock. He said, yeah. And I said, where? He said, it's in Walsh Hall across the quad. I said, goodbye. And I said, thank you for telling me. So off I went across, and I got there at 2 minutes to 3, and and waited out in the hallway, sort of looking at the wall. And then at 3 o'clock, I walked into the classroom filled with 50 people. They nodded to me, and I said, good afternoon. I closed the door, turned to the board, took a piece of chalk, and said, in this class, we're going to be, and I simply outlined the class. Now, talk about writing a check when you don't have any money in the bank. Fortunately, it was a Friday, so I had the week. I had the weekend, right, to pay my debts, right. No, but the thing is that a lack of all this early presentation, in a certain sense, gives more spontaneity, because you're teaching out of yourself. You're not teaching ahead to a kind of schema that you're imposing. And often what happens is that you think you're delivering something, but you're not. You're not packaging something. You're interrupting somebody's train of thought in a certain sense. And which you can't always succeed in doing, but it sort of parallels one's own life of willing to be interrupted. Because one could easily say, no, I'm not going to continue doing this, or we have the ability to do it, but we don't always follow our best intention. And what happened to me last week is a perfect example of this. One whole year ago, I received a letter from an email from two professors of linguistics at the University of Bochum, and they say, we're doing a handbook on expressivity for Oxford University Press. And we want you to write the chapter, an 8,000 word chapter on expressivity in semiotics. Fortunately, the beer was cold. I had thought ahead a few days. So, you want to say, am I going to really do this? Expressivity and semiotics. It's such a large, vague topic. Because no matter how much you know about semiotics, it's expressivity. Well, semiotics studies forms of expression. Of course, in sign expressions are embodied in signs, etc. But I said, okay, I will do it. Well, last Thursday, I sent it off, the chapter. And I had 2 versions of the chapter. And I had renamed the chapter so to make sure I didn't mix them up when I sent them. And it was late on a Thursday. It was 11:30, 11:45. So, boom, off it goes. I said, I got to get to bed. This has just been a long, long trip to get this thing in order from Peirce's theory of feelings and of theory of quales to biosemiotics. It went the whole route. And I went to bed and slept like a combination of the devil was an angel, so I slept like both a devil and an angel that night. Got up the next morning saying, I wonder whether they've answered back, that they say just, we got it, right? Thank you very much. So in order to make sure everything was fine, I pushed on them an attachment to the email that I had sent them. Wrong version. I sent them the version that I was not supposed to send to them. It wasn't the right e-file. So I have to say, no, I sent you the wrong, I didn't say, I was tired and I had had an extra glass of wine. I didn't say those sort of things, but I had made the mistake. But at the same time, I realized that if they thought that version was good enough, and they said, don't worry about it, we looked at it and it's fine, but we will use this new one, the new version, right? It had better footnotes and things of this sort. But there were times, I have to say, where I wondered whether I had agreed to do something that I really shouldn't have agreed on, in the light of other things that one has to do. But in a certain sense, when we're teaching philosophy, and whatever the course materials would be, we are in a certain sense giving students tools to not do what we ourselves have done, say, on occasions, right? But there's very rarely been a student that I've had who took philosophy who said it was a waste of time. And they have also often made really wonderful comments, and that's my next anecdote. I had a student, she was a very interesting student, Pega Lashkarlu, and she showed up in one of my classes, and her first papers were not very good, so she came to my office, and I was going over her papers with her, and she said, we were in the course of talking, she said, well, I learned this and I learned that, but I learned this when I was doing my service in South Africa. And I said, oh, you're a Baha'i, aren't you? True. She was an Iranian. She was a Baha'i. Because when she said I did my service, I knew exactly what was happening. But I didn't know what had happened to her. She had been tortured and had fled over the mountains with her family and ended up in Brooklyn with nothing. And now here she was in the philosophy class. And she took a number of courses with me, and she had also had been in high school with one of my colleagues' wife, who was a teacher in the high school, so that I knew that she knew her. So finally, right before she graduates, she's in my God and philosophy class. So we're reading Donald Crosby's books, and we're reading all sorts of very interesting things, Dewey's Common Faith, and all the types of things you would teach to undergraduates. So the very last class, I walk in, and you're always there a few minutes before, so et cetera, and I just look out, and she raised her hand and said, "Can I make a comment?" Now, for many cases, that would put the fear of the Lord into any prof, namely, no, right? And you go behind the desk and hope that you become deaf. And I said, "What is it, Pegah? What would you like to say?" She said, "You have us just where you want us, don't you?" I smiled and I said, "Yes, I do. I've enabled you to ask that question. I do have you just where I want you. Namely, I've given you the tools. You've got to build your own building now, right? I've given you the materials that you need for you to make these type of life decisions of what does God mean, and what does nature mean, and what does religion mean, etc." Said, "I'm not here to tell you what you should be thinking. I'm here to tell you what you should be thinking about. Not just to tell you, but to show you." Right? And so Pegah, she took it, the class smiled, but you also saw them physically relax. It's okay not to be able to totally make these types of conceptual or existential decisions, because I know what types of backgrounds they are coming from. They're coming from, in many cases, conflicted religious backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, and you have to be able to handle them. And it's a very different from the student who comes up after the first class and say, "I want you to know we're on the same side." You say, "What side?" No, it almost always happened in the garden of life. We're on the same side. "What side?" He said, "God." I said, "What do you mean, God?" He said, "I mean God, like, God. You know God." And I say, "That's what the course is about. So we're trying to figure out what we mean here, what we're doing, right?" And they say, "Well, okay." They will accept that you don't feel obligated to hand them too many possible answers in teaching philosophy, just as I think ourselves, as we continue to pursue, because every day, all of us here who are experienced, we should be open to being interrupted and saying, "Yeah, that wasn't really exactly what I thought I should have been doing, or what even should have been done." So what applies to the students would apply to us. And I think if you reflect upon your own history, your own intellectual and conceptual history, these are the sort of the major issues that we have to solve for ourselves. But we don't necessarily have to think we have to work them out in front of the students, but we have to give exemplifications of what it means to be perplexed. And in all of my courses, and this is still connected with the things you were talking about, Jared, is the first class I said, this course is like a set of scissors. Scissors have an upper blade and a lower blade. So this course is a scissors, and what are the lower blades and what are the upper blades? And I said, the upper blade, of course, you cannot use you can use a scissor, but you have to use it if it doesn't have a second blade. So those two blades have to come together. So I said, what is going to come together in this particular course? And I did this in art and philosophy course. I did it in the Ways of Knowing course. I did it in the courses on Marxism and political philosophy. I did it in all those types of courses that I was teaching. I said, you have to have exemplifications that, in trying to understand them, you need a set of intellectual tools. Why are you perplexed about this? Is it just because you don't have a dictionary and can't look up how to spell a word? Or is it there's something wrong, or there's another way for me to understand this particular problem. So, but if you go at it blindly, you're just going to have to make a decision. But philosophy saves you from making blind decisions, so that you understand the importance of making non-blind decisions. And for that, you need a second blade. You need a cutting blade of concepts, so that you can begin to talk about what it is that you are perplexed about. So the students in God and philosophy class were perplexed about God, whatever God meant, which is an open semantic space for them. And one had to show them that this space was not a closed space. There were doors of getting in, right? But the problem was not to get trapped within it because you didn't have a key. But that doesn't mean you're escaping from the God problem, or whatever it would be, or the beauty problem, or the form problem, or the meaning problem, or whatever that is. But you have to understand that I'm just not going to come in and talk about linkages of concepts. Philosophy is not it's like a rosary of one bead after the other, but you've cut the rosary in half, so but where does it go? Well, you go to one end, you go to the other end, but the rosaries were meant to be, you moved around them, and not just, okay, now I'm holding the rosary, what do I do? It's that philosophy is open-ended, but it's not open-ended in that way. Hey, I've exhausted my beads, my analytical beads. It's not it. And I have found over the years that this was the best way to teach philosophy. And I taught from the early beginning freshman students to the PhD students in engineering. My university had the large-scale engineering programs. We have a nuclear reactor. There's their own nuclear reactor. We have all the students, and the dean called me in, the dean of engineering, said, we want this course taught. We want this mandatory seminar for all the students who are in the Doctor of Engineering program. We want a course on engineering or technology and philosophy. So that was me for a number of years. I was sitting with the engineers and other students who were in the technical fields, including, as I'll say now, how many of you have Android phones? I had a student, a very cool guy, used to come and talk to me, really cool. He talked to me like an equal, which was very good. He wasn't afraid to tell me what he thought. And he would come in and sit in the chair. We would talk about whatever came to mind, but he was cool, laid back, etc. His name was Rich Miner, and he disappeared. He graduated, right, and he went on, and he went into the high-tech world, to the computer world. And last year, the university newsletter said that the Department of Computer Science, the Department of Computer and Information Sciences, has just been given $5 million grant. I said, wow. Who gave that $5 million? Rich Miner, a student that I had in class, but who was a computer science major. I said, where did he get $5 million to give away? Well, he and his friend wrote all the code that makes your phone or your computers work. So of course they renamed the whole department after Rich Miner. It became the Rich Miner School of Computer Science and Computer and Information Sciences. Now that's very interesting to think that you have students there who gained sort of a kind of combination analytical attitude that allowed them to be open to doing something that further the things that he was most interested in, right? It wasn't just code. He realized what he was doing was an important social issue that he would further. So the things that we would talk about as philosophy profs, though all of us who have spent our lives teaching, I think, are exemplified. We ourselves walking around are the lower blade. We are the exemplifications of the very things that we then would stand up and try to give an apologia pro vita mea type of thing of how one would unravel and explain one's life. That leads me to my last comment about Langer. Many years ago, my wife and I, we were on our way to spend the summer in Denmark with Mariana's family, and a letter came out of the blue from Clark University, a woman in the English department at Clark University, asking me would I take a look at her 300-page dissertation on medieval poetics. Oh, the big thing. You've packed for the trip. You don't use checked luggage. Where do you put this huge telephone book size for the PhD dissertation? And I took one look at it. I said, oh, no. And Mariana said, let me see. Her whole thing was in literature, so she was, that was what her degrees were in, her graduate degrees. And she said, I will take a look at it. So she did, and she helped the author of it out, and I thought that was the end of the matter. Then I received a letter saying, we're going to have a summer seminar in Schengen, and we want you to participate in this seminar. And it was a letter from her and from another person at Clark who was the head of the psychology department. So 2 summers in Schengen, in the Chateau de Schengen, where they signed the Schengen Agreement. And my joke is always I slept in the prime minister's bed, but I don't know which prime minister was there who was signing the things. And then you say, great, so we had 2 summers, all expenses paid, everything you wanted, no questions asked, and we made a book out of it called Semiotic Rotations. But at the meeting were not just philosophers, there were linguists, there were sociologists, there were psychologists, there were all sorts of people. And we had prepared papers for the meeting, the first meeting, and then there was a quick discussion of them, a kind of presentation. And then the real rule was that you had to take notes on the recommendations, and we're going to come back the next summer, and everybody was going to go over other people's papers again to make sure that they had done the corrections. Well, it wasn't really a sacrifice because they were paying the freight, right? But out of that came another set of linkages. It's a trail of linkages. The cultural psychologist had been the head of the psychology department at Chapel Hill, at North Carolina, University at Chapel Hill. And he had then resigned that position and gone to Clark, where Sigmund Freud had gone and where you had all the other development of the early parts of psychology. But he was an Estonian, and we hit it off very, 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 very well, and we did everything, and that was fine. I went down to Clark and gave a talk on Bueller and a few others, and then in the course of one of the meetings there, he said, "Do you have a Danish personal identification number?" It's like a social security number. And I said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. Since I paid taxes, I had paid taxes in Denmark, and having been there before, you had to have that number to be, if you got sick. So it was for your medical treatment, etc. And I said, yeah, okay, but that was the end of it. So time came for me to retire from the university. I said, I've maxed out my pension. I now need more free time. So I'm going to leave. I retired, and then I said, I'll teach one course a semester of my choosing at my own schedule, etc. They said, okay, that's fine. You can do whatever you want, just as long as ultimately you close the door after you when you've left. And I said, okay. I said, my last semester will be 2014. So in the spring of 2014, I received a letter from my Estonian colleague who had now moved to Denmark. He had been named the Niels Bohr professor of psychology at the Niels Bohr Center at Aalborg, which is on the northern tip of Jutland, if you know any of the geography of Denmark. So I said, what do you want from me? He said, well, we have a lot of money now to invite you for 5 years. Now, why would one do this? Well, so we want it because we're running all these international seminars, and with the EU graduate students, students could go all over and take these be in the programs with summer schools that were very, very interesting. And we're going to do, the first summer will be interactive, the arts of interaction, interacting with the arts, and you are going to be directing it. Well, of course, we did it, but the thing is this is another linkage that led to all these other types of things. They're all accidental, but they all have a content. So I think part of teaching our students, the life lessons, right, is to say, find a way of living up to your own demands and of the demands of others, but also knowing how to refuse the demands, and also maybe refusing the demands you would make on yourself, right? And I think Langer herself is a perfect example of living her own life in spite of the resistances and oppositions and really bitter types of reactions to what she was doing. And one of the worst examples I ever heard of this was, and I think I know why it occurred, was Thomas Sebeok, who was the very famous semiotician. I had a very sort of difficult relationship with him that had nothing to do with anything that I had done, but something that had been done by him, because many of you, I don't know whether if you, I don't think it was on the board, didn't mean anything, but in 1985 I published a big anthology on the basic text of semiotics. I call it the Green Book because it has a green cover. And how did I ever get to do an anthology on semiotics? Well, it happened that I had received a letter from Indiana University Press from the director saying, would you please function as a referee for this project? It was a project on the basic text of semiotics, and making some recommendations of what you think should be included in that volume, and do you think these other types of recommendations make any sense? So I said, yeah, I'd be willing to do it. I got the letter and I sent, yeah, I made my recommendations and just simply forgot about it. And then a month later, I'm sitting in my office and the phone rings and it says, hello, this is John Coleman from Indiana University Press. He was the director of the press. And what he said was Lowell. He didn't go to any boards of trustees. He ran the press with a hard fist, but he was very successful. And he said, I'm phoning you about the semiotics book that Tom Sebeok has proposed doing. And I said, yeah. He said, I want you to do it instead. Now, that's like attacking the warden of the prison, who's the only one who owns the keys to let you out if you've been pardoned. I said, wait a minute here. It's not only his book, it's his series. He's the series editor. I said to him, he said, I don't care, I'm the boss here. Now, boy, this is putting your head in the meat cleaver for me. If I wanted, Sebeok ruled the semiotic world with an iron hand, and he wasn't afraid to shoot you. He shot me later. Several years later, he found a way of really sticking it to me. But that's only a funny episode because it didn't really matter. But getting involved in semiotics was like coming in through the back door. But if you look at the Green Book, you find one of the central chapters is the chapter from Philosophy in a New Key on discursive and presentational forms. But Sebeok, with that tongue of his, at a public meeting, knowing that I was there, etc., he said, the worst book ever written, he said. The worst book ever written, he said. Wow.
Wow.
Huh?
Afraid of her.
Really even-handed guy, I have to say. I have to say, right? So you said, well, it doesn't matter because he didn't dare block a book in his own series. So it went through, and he got angry because we sold about 15,000 copies of the book. It was used in multiple texts, and there was the British edition and all these various things. So you go through this sort of stuff. But years later, I was going to do a book on Giovanni Vailati, who was an early Italian pragmatist. His Scritti is a huge volume of things, and I was going to publish a selection of those, translating them from the Italian and write an introduction, and we needed some referees. So I named Umberto Eco, whom I knew personally, and Umberto said he would write one of the letters, because he was one of the ones who said these materials should exist in English. And Richard Rorty and a few others, philosophers, they wrote in support of it. But Sebeok was one of the referees. And he wrote me and he said, I've written you a very good letter, he said, and I hope you get it. But the foundation from which the money would come sent everybody their letters of recommendations from their so-called supporters. And Tom Sebeok was one of the most vicious things I'd ever read, because he demanded absolute obedience to himself, right? And he loved being the kingmaker. But the fact is, it made no difference, right? Because there was no loss. It was not as if one had done a whole big project, and many of the people have written books, and it takes 20 years to get it published, right? I mean, James Joyce was not exactly people jumping up and down to publish Ulysses and all these various things, right? So I think this type of keeping going is modeled by Langer very much. And she kept going, and she kept being productive because she followed her own thread. There was a kind of golden thread of her scholarly and life activities. And in spite of all the other, in spite of her, she didn't go to pieces with the destruction or the disappearance of her marriage. She still managed, and she still kept writing, and she did what she could, and she kept her self-confidence. Donald knows more about these things than I do, and in terms of the real closeness for the biographical issues. But I think these are the thoughts that I had put together, listening both to. I had put those things, basically the same things together in my prepared comments, but putting together what Adrian and Jared said, I think these are the these are the types of things I would say we should at least think about and see to what degree the lessons that I've tried to learn about what I'm doing would apply to everybody here, or how they would be modified, and come up and say, I have a better proposal for you. And say, well, let me see whether I'm buying. And I think that's the thing with Langer. We've got a good offer there, and we have to see whether we're going to buy it. But I would say you're going to get a bargain, an intellectual and life bargain, if you buy this package. Amen. I handled a search committee once that had deans on it. And when you're doing a search for a dean, where there are other deans on it, they're calculating who is going to end up joining our group. who's going to infiltrate my territory. So I'm saying, anyway, what do you want to say to anybody here? Margaret.
I like the idea, well, I'm thinking of body and mind and putting them together, thinking a mindful body. And so I think of that when you talk about living philosophically. It would seem to me that that's part of what you're trying to do when you're teaching philosophy, whatever that means. But of course the class could be, let's do this and let's find out what it might mean. And it's also what it might mean,
Yeah.
you know? I mean, there are all kinds of possible meanings.
Yeah.
And you can have a social, interactive, collective.
You're absolutely right. There was something I was going to read at the beginning that bears directly upon what you're saying here, namely, from the time that I was in Aalborg, and my Estonian friend Jan Valsener had a lot of connection with Brazil, and I go to Brazil practically every November for the international meetings of practice. I've been doing it now for 10, 12 years. But you meet a lot of different people, and the cultural psychologists are so much interested in philosophy, semiotics, they're interested in aesthetics, etc. So, and on creativity. And we have done a series of books on creativity. They asked me to be one of the contributors to the books on creativity. And another one of was an Italian colleague who was in Aalborg likewise, who lost his job, by the way, because he spent too much time in Brazil. True. We did a book on the dialogical aspects of creativity. That creativity is dialogical. It's part of the Emersonian thing of all thought is in one sense derivative. What is not derivative is the sense of connection that you can make with them. And I was going to read you just a small passage here from Goethe, which is, I think, deals with pedagogy likewise, but also with ourselves. Goethe said in a letter to Schiller, to Friedrich Schiller, he said, "I hate everything that merely instructs me without increasing or directly quickening my activity." Amen. If we could only live by this, but that's this whole thing of what it means to have your activity quickened, to be enlivened. And I think we seek it in ourselves. We want to have a sense of vitality and of livingness. Livingness is just not the characteristic of a work of art, of a significant form. It's our own bodies that are manifestations or exemplifications of livingness. And I love this notion of augmenting or heightening of one's activity. He uses augmentieren. But then there is a second passage where Goethe said, "Ordinary people don't know how much time and effort it takes to learn how to read. I've spent 80 years at it, and I still can't say that I've reached my goal." when you consider that sovereign figure of Goethe, this incredible Olympian type of intellect with his auteur, etc. Wow, that's really something. And this text, it's a citation. I've read all these things before because I've read the Conversations with Eckermann, which is one of the most wonderful books of intellectual history. There's a passage from Pierre Hadot on philosophy as a way of life, spiritual exercises from Socrates to Foucault. And this is what Hadot says, who was a fantastic historian of ancient philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy. He says, and yet we have forgotten how to read, how to pause, to liberate ourselves from our worries, return into ourselves, and leave aside our search for subtlety and originality, in order to meditate calmly, ruminate, and let the text speak to us. This too, Hadot says, is a spiritual exercise and one of the most difficult. As Goethe is reported to have said in Conversations with Eckermann, ordinary people don't know how much time and effort it takes to learn how to read. 80 years at it, and I still can't say I've reached my goal. Boy, oh boy. Right on. That is, but I think this pausing and reading is a goal with the text. We would say, I signed 2,000 pages of readings in my course. And all the freshmen read it. Really? Don't believe it for 1 second. All you have to do is walk the hallway and talk to people. Or they come to your office and complain. Professor X has assigned us this. It's not possible. It's not physically possible. Not even for him. He probably hasn't even read it himself to begin with. Right?
Yep.
So the thing is that this thing of learning, of pausing, right? But the learning and being pausing alone is a matter of also being interrupted, as we're back to that, to this particular thing. But it's the interruptions that lead to creativity. And Goethe himself admitted that almost nothing that he wrote was truly invented out of, they were not rabbits pulled out of a hat. That he admits very clearly that poetry and art is to a great degree reminiscences. That is, of taking over perhaps an unfinished task, some previous product, and going on with it. And it's the same with why would one do a follow-up to say a research project, because the research project did not close doors, it actually opened doors. That's a sign of its heuristic fertility. But there's a heuristic utility, not just of fertility, not just of lives, not just of books and paintings, but for ourselves. There's a way of which we could have a form of life that leads us to make it a life of real meaning determination. And I think that the analytical aspects of Langer's philosophical project are clearly applicable in the deepest existential mode, right? Those are some of the really important lessons for all of us, and even hard as it may seem, but that's one of the consolations of philosophy.
I love Ursula Le Guin using this word of rebearing the rebearing.
Yeah.
To just a footnote to what you were saying.
That you
rebear the what has
Not
happened.
giving birth again. That's yeah.
we
But
bear a burden.
bearing, B-E-A-R, rebearing the heritage for her was the heritage of literature.
Yeah, that's true. Traditor, in the sense, yeah, I bet. Are you talking though about a kind of task that has been assigned to us? I'm not so sure I understand.
I think so. I think, and I, interesting enough, I've talked about this with a journalist is that even every 10 years or so, when I listen to the same symphony, it sounds very different to me.
Yeah.
But it's the same. The piece didn't change. It's ink on paper. But it's not the same. It's not
No.
the same. And then it's this kind of listening. And I don't think that in another 10 years I'll hear the same piece. It will change again. But the text didn't change.
Yeah, but the question then, what is the text? Because the text is there's the whole thing, and the Germans 20 years ago had these things on reading, on active reading, and what text really, how texts were enlivened, and how we are enlivened by text, but also of the changing nature of the text, because the involvement in the text changes. The text is not something that's freestanding. The text is
It
a
has
point
to
of
be
relation.
read.
Is a point of relationship, right? And we did a meeting years ago with the Society for Advance of American Philosophy, dealing with the nature of reading. And I'm trying to remember now. There was a famous woman, educator who was really much involved in the analysis of reading. And why I'm having a blank spot here, I cannot fully remember her name, but Vincent Colapietro, who was a good friend of mine, and myself were the commentators. It was a large meeting. She was very annoyed at us because we had said that we could be, here's another way of understanding what you are saying. But she says, no, there's no other way of understanding this except the way I've got it. I've disappeared, they said, and we managed to sort of calm things down, right? As you can well imagine. I wish it's in my resume. I can tell you what's called. But what I wrote was Pragmatism and the Fate of Reading, because she was a really wonderful specialist in the reader text and interaction, and it's. But what happened on the stage with us, and what happened in the dialogue later, when we published the proceedings, was an example of what you're. I think of the point you were making here of the same is not always the same, and we're not the same. We're not the same at all. Melissa, did you have a question?
Yeah,
Okay.
Not question, but I'd like to respond. As a person whose background is in philosophy and who has a language barrier, English is not my first language. It has been very, I felt, maybe I like to share my feeling, I felt I was in out of space, or I was in a wrong place yesterday as I sat and listened to all the presentations. So I was even pondering whether I like to come back today or not, but I am very glad when I listened to Jared's presentation and your presentation. Your personal stories and other people's personal stories spoke more than 1,000 philosophical, technical words. So I appreciate your personal story and your personal journey.
Thank you.
And also I am very moved by not all those words, linguistic, philosophical teachings, but by all the presenters' enthusiasm and dedication to philosophy and teaching of philosophy. I still don't get it
what's in it, but there must be something in it by all your enthusiasm and dedication. Still, it's like a myth or mystery to me. Even though I shouldn't be surprised because I have lived with a philosopher for the past more than 40 years. But still, that's what I felt yesterday and today. There must be something in it, and I like to explore.
There's something in the bottle
Yeah,
that we have to find. What is that elixir? What is in that bottle?
So
People have
not that theory or those linguistic teaching, but by who you are and your dedication and even enthusiasm about all those difficult words. And so I appreciate your sharing. But I have one question, if I could. I appreciated Jared's presentation that gave me some clear understanding what philosophy tried to pursue. He said philosophy pursue meanings of life or meaningful life. That's what I thought when I decided to come here. What philosophers are talking about meaning of life. And I am a clergy, ordained pastor who has been seeking the meaning of life and how to develop meaningful relationships with God and other people. That's what I have been doing, and it is a journey of that question. How can you pursue the meaning of life without talking about spirituality? Nobody mentioned about the spirituality at all. Even though there are words, I'm very glad to listen to wonder, wisdom, logo that has been I've been using in my ministry and my preaching. So maybe if spirituality might not be something else than daily words or even philosophical words, but nobody mentioned spirituality. So my question is, what's the relationship between philosophy and spirituality? Anything, Langer or philosophers talks about spirituality in philosophical studies.
That is an incredibly complicated question. And those issues very clearly always came up in my God and philosophy class, but it also came up in the other classes, because when you think of the history of art, or if you're using all the examples one would be using in one's art and philosophy class, the objects that the text or the images or whatever else you're dealing with, or the scores of the music and listening or whatever it would be, are reservoirs and instruments for reorienting oneself, and it goes down very, very deep. And I give you an anecdote that I talked about privately the other day, or when we were having dinner in the car. Remember the Hamlet's Mill that went on the board here about Deschamps, the book that was written by Giorgio de Santillana and Herta van Deschen? I happen to know Herta van Deschen very, very well. I knew her on a very, very deep level. And remember that book, in a certain sense, partially reconfigures the whole history of Western Christianity and the high theistic traditions, etc., and their institutional forms. And it was a Christmas Day dinner at my house, and she came with we had mutual friends, so the house was filled, people were wandering around the house, and she sat down on the couch, and I went over and put Bach's B minor Mass on, and I sat down beside her. She started to cry. Tears were just coming out of her, because this whole sense of this complex problem that they had dealt with, of partial debunking, of uncovering the untold history of what was happening with the sacred mushroom, but all the institutional changes. And she was so moved just by the opening passages of the Bach Remarum. And I am too. I have chills right now when I think about what it was. I just put my arm around her, and she just cried and cried. And then, we got on with business, namely of the family and kids all around the table, Christmas table, and that being it. But you want to say, why did she cry? There was something. She was moved deep, deep, deep down at the deepest spiritual level of the orientational axes of her life, were shifted by Hamlet's Mill. And the intellectual world, likewise, whatever you think of whether the thesis is actually correct or not is not the issue. It's what the very author of the book thought, and how that had affected her and interacted with her own prior existential spiritual state. She had a platform, but in many cases, the whole point of that book is to show that there is a different platform. And when that platform is where the sledgehammer is taken to it, that involves a lot of difficulty for everybody. I have one other thing. It's not a secret. Donald Crosby, whom I'm very, very fond of, has written a whole sets of books on religious naturalism. And he was a Presbyterian minister for many years and an active pastor, but he was also a professor of philosophy. And he said it became more and more difficult for him to continue to be a pastor in combining with his philosophical commitments, which were very much into philosophical naturalism. But of course, the God and the God concept is not excluded by religious naturalism. It just uses a different reconfiguration of the place of the concept, the God concept. And but he found it so difficult to compose his sermons. And one day, apparently in the middle of a week or something, he was working on his sermon, and his wife came up to him and saw. He said, I was having so much difficulty. And she said, you don't believe a word you've been saying, do you? And he said, no. And he resigned. Now, I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just saying that's an illustration of his saying, yeah, I'm not speaking in an authentic voice. Now, spirituality, I think, as you're using it, is the root of an authentic voice. And if you are practicing against that authentic voice, there's a constant existential tension. And his wife saw it. It was written all over his body, right? Jared?
Yeah. On that point too, first of all, I appreciate your story about how you decided to come back today, and I think we're all glad that you did come back. On that idea of this question of spirituality and meaning making, for Langer, at least as I understand her, it's important to remember that making meanings is making connections, right? It's about relation. So both the connection between things, like between different ideas, but also your connection. So the more connected we are to something, the more meaningful it is for us, right? The more that we experience it as meaningful. And so I think it's not a bad way to define spirituality as just the quest for being connected in general to the world and to all of our experiences. But if we want to look at more specifically organized religions or organized spirituality and these sorts of traditions, what they're often about is about connection, either to a deeper level of reality or a higher level, if we want to say something like that, like, or what does it mean to be connected to totality, to the absolute, whatever word we want to use for that, whether it's Brahman or God or, So that's also, that would be for Langer meaning making, right? It's just, rather than connecting this idea or this experience or this feeling, it's what does it feel like in like a Langer, this idea of feeling, what does it feel like to connect to everything, to totality? And that's sort of, in that sense, like this highest quest of spiritual traditions. So it is about meaning making. So I think you can easily link that into Langer. She's thinking about, well, what does it mean to connect to all sorts of things, and what does it mean to make meaning in all sorts of ways? And if we want to separate theology or religion from Langer's style of philosophy, we would just say, well, they're attempting very specifically to make a connection to totality or the absolute, or to, depends on your tradition, maybe a deeper level of reality or something, if we're talking about Hinduism or different traditions. But, I mean, it's all sort of the same at the end of the day, right? But so, meaning is about connection, and I think spirituality is about connection too. So that's how I would throw that into the ring.
Bob's answer to this is going to be the end.
He answered all that.
I know, but I heard his talk, but his response to whatever you're saying is now going to be the end. So
You get the last word.
are you connected to God or not, Bob?
Randy said he was a Methodist the other day, and I said, loose or tight? He said,
There's only one
I'm
kind.
both. I'm a loose and a tight Methodist at the same time.
I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan. That's my rating.
Thank you, thank you.
What did Sergeant Preston at the Yukon